and welcome to episode 6 of the RedShark interview podcast, the show where we dive deep into the people, the stories, and the tech shaping the creative industries. I'm your host, Chris Wells, and today I'm joined by Baird, supervising sound editor, sound designer, as well as the owner of Aquarium Studios, one of Europe's leading sound design and audio post companies. Ben's CV is super packed, from capturing the noise magic of football for past FIFA games, which of course we talk about, as well as helping sculpt the soundscapes for this year's shockingly relevant Conclave, in which we do get to do a big, deep, nerdy dive into. There will be spoilers for that film if that's a thing you care about, and I would recommend seeing Conclave, even just to get a bit more context about what we talk about. I personally loved it, and the sound is fortunately super unique for that film, and I think, to be honest, it's one of the film's best hidden weapons, at least hidden to those not as nerdy about this kind of thing like I am. We also chat about what makes a film sound memorable, a new film from one of my favourite directors that I didn't know about until this chat, as well as about Ben's work on numerous documentaries. This chat was recorded online just last week, and without further ado, let's get to it. Thank you very much for coming on, Mr. Baird. How are you doing today?
Yeah, very good. Nice to meet you, Chris.
So for the audience at home, can you just explain what your job title is and kind of how it works on a kind of day-to-day basis when it comes to film production?
Yes, I suppose as I've grown older, I've adopted more the name of the title of sound designer. I think it sort of sounds grander than maybe sound engineer. And there was a point in my 40s where I thought it's time to promote myself, so I picked the word sound designer. But I think that it's really one of those names that covers many sides of the sound industry. But I think it's, a supervising sound editor is probably totally a similar role. It just sort of sounds bigger. But I think, on a day-to-day basis, I'm overseeing all the departments of the sound post-production on a feature film. So, for example, there's Jack Wensley, who's our head of dialogue and head of audio, and I will work with him on the dialogue and describe how I'll be looking for, sort of the dialogue to be presented. So obviously a lot of films that we work on, we aim for very quiet, subtle soundtracks, and so we have to discuss and decide that we're going to have to make the noise floor very much lower to be able to achieve that. So that's something to discuss. Or if it's more of an action piece, then we'll say, well, actually, we can put a bit more leeway on that. So there'll be that side, and that'll be a discussion between me and him, and then I'll discuss it with the director of what we can offer. And then on the sound effects side, we've got quite a sort of large team of sound effects editors who work with us. Archie Lamont is our sort of in-house person who's sort of beginning to come up to do that kind of work. And then we do a lot of work with Jamie McPhee and Alexi Mungersdorf. And I will again discuss with them what kind of the sound that we're looking for. I usually now make a plan. I have a Pro Tools session where I have several tracks that are just notes of how the thoughts are. The very first time I thought I'd do that, I was thinking, you can't do that. It's too organic and it's sort of how I feel. But actually, I would go and make these notes, and everyone would have them so they can see where the film's going, the soundtrack's going. And then obviously there's Foley, so we do a lot of Foley with Rob Price and his Earth Sound team, and we again we'll discuss it. And actually, because we're trying to make soundtracks that are a character in the film, I don't really subscribe to the phrase that a good soundtrack is one you're not aware of. Obviously I don't want to make a bad soundtrack, but I think that it can actually be a character. And Rob does a lot of Foley. He's sort of very much the sort of sharp end of recording actual sounds, rather than a lot of the other stuff is from either libraries or from the production. And so we would actually discuss new recording techniques to grab sounds. So it's not all Foley in the studio. In fact, as time goes on, it gets less and less. And again, this will be discussing with the director all the times what they'd be looking for. I think the primary thing is often what happens is you get an interview and the director asks you some questions about what you do, and you answer those questions. And then the goal is to actually deliver what you said you're going to deliver. Yeah. It's very easy to sit there and come up with some fancy words and then just not deliver that soundtrack. So I think sort of, and also there's a language, so a lot of the times you'll have people saying, directors will be saying, can you make it more tense, or could you make it more green, or could and
Mm.
actually to understand that language and to say make it more tense or feel more green or feel sort of all of those kind of things. So sort of I feel like I'm a translator as well between sort of what the director's looking for, the language they use to describe it, and then how to turn that language into the reality of what comes out the loudspeakers.
Yeah, that's a fantastic definition. Wow, that you've actually um, unlocked a bit of my brain there, because I truly believe that sound is more, if not like slightly more important than the visuals when it comes to a lot of video and film. Like, I've seen things that look terrible, but when the sound is good, it still works. Like, if you watch it on mute, the effect doesn't work. It kind of makes sense to me, like, the way the cinematographer is often the person that will translate what the director kind of sees. Yeah, your job to kind of translate what the director hears, which I can imagine, because you've worked on hundreds of films, like your IMDb is like 100 strong, like
Yeah,
250, I think it was
yeah, it's been
last
a
I looked
great,
just
yeah.
in. Yeah, which is amazing. And I can imagine, while working with such a breadth of people and obviously a lot of different responsibilities, especially directors and filmmaking people, like, I want the film to look like this. It needs to, this aspect ratio, black and white, this thing. How often is there a strong vision for the sound when you have those conversations?
That's a very interesting question. I think by the time that we start working on the sound, there's usually a strong vision. But in the discussions that happen beforehand, I think that there's often a sort of looking for where, especially because I've done a lot of sort of first films, and where there's looking for where the sound possibilities are. And so when you start describing, and obviously I can be quite descriptive, but also I can use my mouth to make the sound. So it'd be more like a sort of ooh, or a
Mm,
sort of an all that. I think that then you suddenly realise that people have opened up something, and then they can start saying what it is that they want. I think it's sort of like, I think it's very important to understand that we are serving the director's story and his vision. And it's very easy to sort of forget that and start sort of saying, well, this is my soundtrack and all the rest of it. And I think it's very important to always ground yourself into remembering I'm trying to find out what they want to make. So sometimes I think as you get more and more experience, I mean, with a lot of the films we've worked on, not first film people, then the language is already there. And
mm,
um, and again, some directors are more exploratory. Some will sit there and say, yeah, try it, try this. And some will be very definite, saying, I'm looking for this and I want this to work. Don't step outside of that boundary.
mm,
So it is a wide variety really of choices, but I think the important thing, and I think there's something I discovered, fortunately, in sort of my early 30s, is in the same way as you go to a restaurant and you want your steak well cooked. It's annoying to be the chef well cooking the steak, but ultimately that's what the customer wants, and
once.
so you have to make it what they want. But actually, I'm never delivering a well cooked steak in a scenario like that. It's always very, very interesting, and a lot of the time, because every single film is a learning opportunity. And you'd sit there and have, well, I had this idea, I thought this idea was brilliant, but the director doesn't like it, and you sort of would have a little internal sulk about it. And I think that was the important thing, to make an internal sulk rather than external sulk.
Mm,
And then you sit in the cinema and watch it, and you think, you know what, they were right.
mm,
And I must remember that, because that feeling that I had while something that you're working on hour by hour, it's like at the immense detail, and you think this is a great thing, and then someone says, I don't really like that, can you try something different? And you go off and then watch it. You have to remember you're not always right. And in fact, when you're not always right, you can then be more exploratory and discover new things.
yeah.
And so I think you're sort of, so yeah, but it's very, everything's different. It's human beings. It's not, there's no one size fits all. We set out for every project to be different.
Mm,
I don't have a template on my Pro Tools session. On the principle, I think that everything should be built from the ground up, which sometimes is extremely time consuming and annoying. And I'm sometimes sitting there thinking, I've actually built something very similar to what my template would have been. But on the
mm,
other hand, it makes you explore the new plugin options. It makes you explore the new, your sort of immersive stuff that Pro Tools now allows you to do it with Atmos and other recording techniques. And we've recently bought so like a first order or second order microphone to go and try stuff out on. And you sort of think, yes, if I had a set route, then you
mm.
wouldn't explore these things, which I think is important.
Yeah, I can imagine it does it opens your mind into like, yeah, like you said, all the different plugin tools. Cause I think sometimes I've had it before where I get sucked into the template of what I always do. And then all of a sudden everything sounds the same, or I need something different and I
Yeah.
can't do it now because I'm like, well, I don't know what any of these bits do because I've never had the space to kind of experiment with them. I'm desperate to talk to you about some of the films you've worked on, but I feel like just before we do that, I want to kind of just give like the audience kind of a perspective of, so how did you get into your role as a sound designer, as a re-recording artist, as all of this?
Okay. I mean, obviously, as a teenager, like I think 25% of teenagers, I was in a band.
Yeah.
And I mean, the band sort of still plays about once every 2 years. We sort of got a thing going at the Putney Half Moon where we play every couple of years, which is
Wow.
nice. Yeah, I mean, I don't know why they let us do it because but I mean, it's quite a few people come along. They just don't realise it's all our friends and family, and but yeah, and I was in the music industry, and music was very much the thing. My parents were both music teachers, and so it was a natural sort of progression to want to go and work in the recording industries. So I think it was about 19, no, maybe 20 after I sort of left university, having done material science and realizing that is not what I want to do. I wrote off to every recording studio in London. One of them, I mean, there's about 200 and something letters. One
Mm,
wrote back and gave me an interview.
wow.
And they actually did documentaries and sort of museum exhibitions, no broadcast really, apart from documentaries, but these kind of things. They were looking for a music librarian who'd look after the production music libraries that were sent to the studio and get to know them. So I thought, right, okay, I've never heard of this, but that's the music industry. I'm going to get into a recording studio. And they had actually that studio had done the overdubs for, I think, a Motorhead album. And I thought, oh, well,
Yeah.
it's there, we're there. And there's some quite interesting, entertaining, legendary stories about the one day that Motorhead turned up. I think sort of things like the headphones were so loud that even through the soundproof doors, you could hear them out in the street and all that sort of thing. So yeah, I thought that was quite cool. But actually, very quickly, you realise, oh no, this is sound. This is sound to picture. It's not just music, and it's to picture. It's about telling a visual story, or
Mm,
helping tell a visual story. And I thought, actually, this works. One of the things that I was involved in at this company was setting up a new media sound recording department, and we were looking into WAV files. I mean, this is 1993. And all the machines were analog tape machines. I mean, editing was done with a razor blade. Anyway, one evening at midnight, I was working late, and about midnight, I got the phone rang, so I answered it, and there was this voice said, "Do you do computer games?" And I said yes, thinking, right, okay, this is going to be interesting. And he phoned up and said, "Is anything wrong in London? Because I've phoned up hundreds of studios and no one's answered the phone." I said, "Well, it is midnight." And I remember him going, "Oh, shoot, I've got the time difference wrong." And he was phoning from Canada, and he was phoning from Electronic Arts, and they were coming over the following week to record the recordings for, I think, FIFA '96, which had a few utterances in it. And we'd said yes, so we had to then very quickly get prepared for all of that. And actually, it was a very interesting journey then and I think this is where sound design kind of began, because we were involved with this very new computer game technology. And how do you create the sense when a player is playing that they're watching Match of the Day, but also on the pitch?
mm,
And, and actually, if you look at, those sports games, that's exactly where they put you. They put you watching your own highlights,
yeah.
and I think that's always it was very interesting because no one knew before then that was the place to be. Anyway, so we carried on. So we worked with that for many years. I mean, right at the beginning, we were involved in how the data would come off the disc because it only was a CD-ROM side disc on PlayStation 1. So all these sort of limitations we're very much involved
I
with.
was going to say, like, how do you navigate like the compression required to fit it onto a disc? Like, is there certain ways you have to kind of tweak the sound to kind of make it not
Well, yeah.
sound too bad? Because obviously,
Well, I
like,
mean, it was all 8-bit compressed sound on the first few games, and I mean, I remember we came across Waves who were, it's like a very new company at that point, with a new sort of peak limiter that could actually make the most of the 8 bits work. And then there's another data, because the snag with the disc was you had little packet sizes that each sound had to be in, and so it worked out a way that you could have more sound in per packet, and you would be able to identify it. So it was very exciting, very technological. Then when PlayStation 2 and all of those started coming on, then you had more space, and so less of those problems. And then we started working on things like, sort of crowd chants. We had amazing sessions where we got a load of really drunk Manchester United fans into the studio, which had regrettable connotations for some of the bits of the piece of the studio, but actually got quite an interesting result as this sort of kind of this chanting idea. Then, of course, we started sort of going to the Sky trucks at Premiership games and taking feeds from them. And we'd also organised this fantastic couple of days where we organised a football match competition between people who could act, but they had to be footballers. So it took a little while to put these. We put 4 teams together. There was a case of champagne as a competition. We mic'd everyone up, and I think still to this day that's the sort of the on pitch stuff shouts that you get from that game. And they really got into it because they were footballers, but they were actors, so they weren't afraid of shouting. And you could then sit there and say, right, we've had a bit too many. Can we have a little bit less of that and a bit more? So a bit more pain. And they played for the whole day, and there was a winner. We recorded the whole thing. It was very entertaining. So there's lots of things like that.
That's amazing. So then I suppose, is it then someone's job to basically identify individual sounds out of those recordings? Be like, right, that's a grunt.
Yes.
And then kind of cataloguing it all out.
No, it was I think 20,000 bits of usable sound. Obviously, all the swearing, because it's a 3, a kids game. All the swearing had to be removed. But yes, yes. So it was a lot of sounds were gathered that day, and they were all edited and catalogued. Well, that's the things we're used to. We were recording the commentary, which had about 8 or 10,000 utterances in 14 languages, plus every single player name. It was a year's, at some point around 2002, it was a year's worth of work for the team really to do on its own. But now it's more. I think they've taken it in house because we sort of stopped doing it about 2 or 3 years ago. But we were focusing on films, and the model changed. But it was a great experience. Sort of the whole thing developing, especially at the early days, and being part of the experimental area. We also do another competitive football game, PES, and so we weren't allowed to tell PES what we were doing for FIFA until a certain number of years had gone by. I think it was 5 years.
Wow.
And so it was quite interesting because they didn't want them to get too far behind, but they didn't want them to catch up. So that was all quite interesting. Something like that. I mean, it's all changed now. I think it's much more, sort of a much bigger affair. So a little company like ours is no longer really sort of thing. And I think they have licensing all over the place.
Yeah.
So it is a fascinating thing. I mean, I still play it. I mean, when I met my wife, I didn't like football. I didn't like computer games. And now I'm sitting there with my children playing FIFA all the time. And even went to the FA Cup final to watch Crystal Palace that bizarrely I ended up being a season ticket holder of, win the FA Cup.
So I've got a theory on this. One of the things that I find fascinating about like The Last of Us was one of the kind of first ones really that did a lot of this, as well as like Red Dead Redemption 2 as some of the best.
Right.
But a lot of the way that they're recorded, because it's all motion captured, they're always mic'd, and their mic is always here. So it means a lot. I've always found that a lot of the performances in that, it's always even more grounded than normal. Everyone mumbles a lot, but like because the mic is so close, it kind of creates that kind of that character of like everyone acts and talks a lot more naturally. And then I found, because that would have been 2011-ish, I found more and more films as it went on, a lot more of the kind of dialogue recording. Well, like then, a lot more wireless mics I noticed we use, or like tie mic, like really lavalier mics. And I noticed a lot more of the dialogue all of a sudden started sounding a lot more naturalistic in terms of like how close it was recorded. And I always wondered, and I don't know if you've seen this in your kind of experience as well, like the way that dialogue is recorded. Like if you watch like films, even from the 90s, like the way dialogue sounds and how it's recorded, it's always, boomed. And I know they still boom it, but like there always seems to use a lot more of the kind of natural everyone talks at normal volume now, and they kind of talk like this. Yeah, I'm going to go do this. Yeah, I'm going to go over there. As opposed to like,
Yeah.
yeah, in a lot of the kinds of older films, I always find that like, even just subtly, there's a little bit more. What's going on? I'm going over here. I'm really sad now. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. Yeah, I mean, I think that there are changes that have happened. I think if you go back 80s and 90s, well, there are some films which manage actually how we have, sound like a modern film.
Yeah.
There are some films that it does sound like, oh right, there's a microphone about 10 feet away and it's
Yeah.
roughly pointing at the actors, and that's what they're doing, and it is part of that. So that's sort of that kind of documentary, fly on the wall, observational kind of feel. Whereas you have things close mic'd, but it's because I think sort of is how the human brain works. Because you're sitting there talking to someone, and you're interested and engaged by what they're saying, your brain uber focuses on that voice, and so that even in your crowded room, you suddenly your brain can filter out all of these things.
Yeah.
And I think again, one of the things that as a sound designer we're doing is trying to, because when the sound's coming out of a pair of loudspeakers in a cinema, it's a different focus. The brain doesn't have the natural surroundings to do this focus. As you actually, I think you start focusing, helping the focus for the viewer's brain.
Yeah.
So I do find that that's quite interesting. I mean, I love it's obviously in the films that we've done, love the a long shot with the close sound.
Yeah.
Because that's an uber focused thing, and you're right in there. But it is quite interesting with some directors. Some directors don't like that, and sometimes you sort of say, "No, I want it to be like what I've heard in the guide track," and you sort of think, "Right, okay, that's fine." It's I prefer it when everything's very present, so you feel the physicality of the people.
Yeah.
But not every director wants that, so sometimes you don't do that.
I've noticed a lot of it seems to be a lot rarer. I only notice it, in fact, in Alfonso Cuarón films, where the sound is very relative to where the camera's looking. So sometimes,
Right.
like the mixing, like a camera will pan, and you literally hear the sound pan with it. And then
Yeah.
quite a few films, like most films, in fact, don't seem to do that. If a character's talking and it's in a close up, and then it cuts to another close up of a different character, everyone talks at the same volume. But
Yeah.
I
Right.
found like Alfonso Cuarón is one of the only film directors I've noticed where if it cuts to a close up of another character and that character starts talking, it will sound like they're behind, and then as soon as it cuts, it will literally flip the sound to kind of match. So it's like the camera and it is like, and the microphone is like a perspective of the sound from that
Yeah.
position.
Well, I think there's two. I mean, definitely, I enjoy that. I think the point that I find is that it depends on the perspective of what you want the viewer to be listening. So that if it is that you've cut to a shot away and the person's still talking away, and you want to have the sense that in fact us viewers, or where the camera is, are overhearing that conversation, then you'd put a perspective change on it so that you feel that you're in the space, but a different place in the space. Whereas if the meaning, the words are the priority, and the sense of space has got nothing to do with it, you don't want to lose track of the words, then I wouldn't. So there are a few things. And also what we find, I mean, there's a couple of things in recent films I've been doing that, yes, you move the voices and do a perspective change, and you sort of start this because it creates quite an interesting energy with the edits.
Yeah.
And then as the film sort of closes into the nub of what's going on, you stop doing that because it becomes, in fact, you do the reverse. You become closer and closer to the people speaking, regardless of how, where they are. So I think, that is definitely something that with each shot, I do think about it. I'm a very big fan of, an edit's an edit. I have to be wary of things, of sounds that pre-lead a cut.
Yeah.
Or crossfades, because the editor has put these edits in for a rhythm. It's part of the energy of the thing, and I feel that the sound can often help that. So I try and be brutally harsh with all the cuts. And so when something happens that is, as I find a lot of time you're watching telly, especially, and the person from the next scene speaks over the last shot of the previous scene, and there's a fraction of a second where my mind goes saying, hold on, that person's not in the room, what's going on? So I always think, hold on a minute, you have to be very careful with these things. It's very easy once you know the material to sit there and go, but he can be speaking for an hour before we get to the cut. But I guess so sometimes when you haven't seen it before, I know that I'm not the smartest viewer. I watch my wife watching films, and she picks up so many more details. I had to watch Zone of Interest 3 times to get the details she got on the first one.
Yeah.
And so like, but I have to admit, I enjoyed the fact that I could dig deeper each time. But again, there's a soundtrack that really sort of it helps you with what the brain needs to be helped with. But yes, I think that's the thing. So I think it's every instance is has its own case.
Yeah.
And
definitely.
I don't have a principle of always panning things. I don't have a principle of having things always in the center.
Yeah.
It's what feels the best. And often I find myself sitting there, right, I've stopped doing the perspective changes. I wonder why. And then you look at it and say, well, that's because now he's telling her that he loves her, rather than before they were talking about the shopping.
Yeah.
And so that, so like we got to now get into the difficult bit of what he's doing, for example.
Yeah, it's another shift of language, isn't it? It's like when, in film editing, where like you can change to a completely different shot that's not been seen before from a 2-shot, and then all of a sudden it's a close up on front. It's like when that language shifts, even subconsciously, you're like, oh, it's gone to a close up suddenly. Why has it gone to a close up? And it's like you said, it kind of, the way it works with audio is fascinating. And in fact, okay, I'm going to talk about the films now. I'm going to get into
okay, no, that's fine,
because I could talk about this all day. Conclave.
Yes.
I've been very excited talking about this. So you worked on Conclave. What was your role on Conclave?
Well, yeah, I mean, so sound designers, so I've been saying really sort of overseeing the whole soundtrack that, and actually involves, sort of, and mixing it. So I get to bring the music into what we've done. And, but yeah, so really the whole concept. So when I was interviewed for the job, I think Edward Berger was in a taxi and he just asked the question, what does it mean to you? And I said, well, I think silence, kind of conspiratorial silence. And I think that was the sort of the key words. And so it was about then honoring that and to work that out and to bring that to the film. And, as it turns out, there are other elements as well, sort of stress, so like intrigue and sort of treasonous behavior. But yeah, so like I think the bed of it is really a silence.
Yeah, and it really fascinates me actually because like I found in like when they're in like their accommodation stuff, there's almost no like it doesn't even sound like there's a room tone. It doesn't seem to be any kind. It's almost and it honestly it is. I genuinely believe it is a triumph of like sound because that is a film that like I think if it didn't have that sound, it would be a very different film. And I feel like a lot of its tension is brought up like it's incredibly well directed and acted, it's all that, but like there are certain elements of the sound that are so pronounced because there's almost like nothing else because it's basically, if you broke it down, a load of people in rooms talking and or sitting and thinking for a lot of it felt very locational watching the film. So it felt like I said, when he's in his room it's like almost dead silent, like kind of tense until like and it becomes a plot point where he hears things in other rooms. And then compare that to when they're on the like in the courtyard in the Vatican, you can hear like a helicopter over and all of that. So what kind of informed your process of kind of designing those? So like the kind of background, like the room tones, the backgrounds, the atmospheres of each room, like what informed that?
Feelings. So, for example, we developed several different types of silence. I mean, I'm in danger of sounding like someone talking about some wine or whatever.
No, this is gorgeous. I love this. I want to know. Tell me everything.
Because yes, feelings. So so when he's in his, I mean, he's stressed, right? But he's stoic, so he's hiding this, sort of the stress within because he has this job to do, and he breaks down on sort of like 2 occasions really, but he holds it in. And I think sort of the rooms, they're claustrophobic is what we wanted to make them. And I think to have the contrast between the outside, which we don't go to that often. I was sent, I mean, this is one of the beautiful things about working on this particular film is I was sent to Rome to go and do some research. And I had a fantastic weekend in Rome and I watched the Pope do an address in in the St. Peter's and really sense the energy and the I mean, this incredible energy. It's like it's not like a football match. It's the sort of volume of a football match, but with a sort of a kind of a carnival. It's a mixture. It's a new. I can't exactly. We suddenly realised we can't put football crowds in.
Yeah.
We can't put carnival crowds in. It's got people like nuns singing. It's got monks singing. It's got a sort of a level of people giving over to joy that is amazing. When he came out to speak, to watch all these people come into that silence. I mean, you get that if a big stadium on a minute silent, that sense of all these people just listening. And then his voice would resonate around the place. So there's this really rich sense of sound. We sort of put that outside. We spent a long time creating that sound, and then mainly took it away when we went into various places, so that, like, when the doors close on the conclave itself in the Sistine Chapel, again, we wanted that to be claustrophobic, because these people are sort of like in this now enclosed space, even though it's huge. So it's actually got the similar sound design to his bedroom. But also when we get to the Pope's bedroom, when he breaks in.
Yeah.
And I think this is the thing, is when I read the script, and that's the thing about it, it's one of those things, you read the script and it's so exciting.
Yeah.
And it's so well written. You think, all right, there's, already this is fantastic material. But in this scene, he breaks in. And when Sister Agnes comes outside and puts her hand on the door, in the script, it says they sense each other. And she decides that it's okay and moves away. And you're thinking, right, how do you, without the sense of sense?
Yeah.
And so it was an interesting thing. So I always thought that's going to be the quietest moment. When he's in that room, it's the quietest moment. And then it sort of built up from there, that he would, his breathing and her breathing would kind of connect onto the door, around the door as we go inside. She's outside in the hall, which has got the buzz of the lights. He's inside with the silence. All the barriers were kind of like soundproof doors. Everything was sealed, so you could have this huge contrast between places.
Yeah.
And so that when their breathing is connecting, you feel, they are connected. And then when she walks away, you have a slight sense. I mean, it's so hard to know exactly how successful it is. Probably different people read it differently. But that was the general idea. And it's also very important to point out that Edward, I mean, he directed us very well. He allowed a large scope for us to try things. And then once there was something that was going in the direction he liked, he would then be right behind it. And so the breathing was a very important part of it.
There's so much breathing. It's got more breathing than I've ever seen in a film, and it works.
It has probably got the most breathing from any film. But it was a fascinating journey, because we sat there and discussed it and said that the weight of the world is on his shoulders, and the weight of the world includes the people in the cinema. So we make it a physical, something they can feel, a physicality that you can feel in the cinema. And so we had a whole session that was just, he breathed the whole film.
Oh wow! And
he I mean, obviously he's very serious about the part, so it wasn't just a matter of breathing.
So this was Ralph Fiennes. This was Ralph.
Yeah, Ralph Fiennes. Yeah, and wow. he would he worked. I can't say that necessarily it was. He loved the experience of having to breathe the whole film, but he totally brought that. The fact is, his breathing was actually belying what he was feeling inside, even though he's speaking as someone who's in control. And I think he really sort of captured that and really helped that. And then, Edward then, he absolutely locked onto it and wanted it possibly louder than I thought it was, sort of thing. And actually, but it's very stress making.
Yeah. And
I think it's, again, that's his feeling. So I think to answer the original question, all the sound design ideas are coming about what do you want the audience to feel? And it's not, I mean, I remember, I used to do, I still do from time to time, talks at various film courses. And I remember coming across something on the internet where Alfred, and it's possible that I've embellished this, that Alfred Hitchcock used to say that people don't go to the cinema to watch the mundane. And they certainly don't go to listen to the mundane. That's the bit I may have added. But the idea that you don't, the background traffic that our lives are full of, and the background sounds that our lives are full of, that in fact we spend our lives filtering them out. We don't sit there and, you don't go to go on holiday or go out in London and remember the background traffic. You don't sit there and tell someone about the story unless it was so noisy that it actually ruins your evening. And so I think that, again, part of it is we take all that mundane stuff out. Like, okay, for example, here's a good example. If you go to a funeral and you're sitting in a church And you've got that moment when the person who's going to give the eulogy is walking up to the pulpit to give his eulogy. You, as a person, try and be as quiet as you possibly can. You don't want to be, and if you have to cough, you cough. And one person might cough because they give in, but you don't want to make a noise. You don't want to fidget. And I think a lot of times in the past, you're doing a scene like that, and they'd say, could you put a movement track in for the sense of the audience? And actually, I thought, what's quite interesting is you're playing to a cinema. There's your audience. And if you then play no sound, apart from the footsteps of the person walking up to the pulpit, then the audience is exposed and they don't want to make a noise.
They don't. I watched it on my own at home, and I felt that I was like fascinated by like you kind of feel that. And it takes me back. The one thing it always reminded me of, funnily enough, it actually unlocked a memory. Just that experience was of it in exams, being a kid doing like GCSE exams and things, because that's a very similar thing where you can't make a noise.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think that is, that physicality is a very important part of what we're trying to do. And I think we found science. I think, when we did Lady Macbeth, we had a whole experience of what it was like to have nothing in the room apart from the resonance of the voice and the movements. And I think a lot of that. So when you got two people. There's one shot I remember really enjoying that it's a sort of long shot of Ralph Fiennes in the Sistine Chapel, and the other fella he was talking to his left, and he's just standing on his own, and he moves, and it's just the move of his cassock resonating in the thing, and that's the only sound in there. And you think actually that's a sort of, that feels like the sort of memory thing that if you were sitting there observing him, and then he moved, you would be sensing that it's so quiet. You could hear the movement of some cloth from 50 feet away. So I think it's sort of playing with those sort of things, but it's memory, and obviously not everyone has the same memories. I think that's the other thing. But this is how you describe something to someone.
Yeah, the jingles of the jewelry as well, I noticed. They would come and go a lot. Like, so there'd be like scenes where like there'd be none at all, and then some where you hear literally like every from the...
Yeah, again, stress.
Yeah.
So it was more of a sort of like, so it's a worry bead, a sort of stress thing often.
Yeah, because the thing that I found about the film, and you can tell me if I'm wrong on this, it felt very percussive. Like that, I think because of the silences probably, and because of the way the score is as well. Like that, it is very much like it's not just it's not like an ambient. There's not a lot of ambient sound that kind of blends in. It's very much like, if you put it through like a low pass filter, you just hear a lot of like there's a lot of kind of almost like spikes of sounds over quiet. And I think like, once again, I've not really seen that in a lot of films. And like, I can imagine, was there a kind of, I don't know, hesitation or worry by kind of removing so much that it would like, because, I always found, and this is just me, and this is amateur recording hour, like I find room tone is very helpful for covering over some of your edits and things like that. And all of a sudden, when you don't have that to kind of almost like help blend things in.
I think, I mean, yes, obviously you're nervous about everything. And actually, if I'd known how big Conclave was going to be, because obviously, so like if you look at the films I've worked on, so like the fact is that everyone I know has seen it. Whereas usually I've got one or two friends who said, "Oh, I saw the film that you worked on." That would probably have been more. I'm very glad that we didn't. But I would be more afraid of what we were doing because this is an odd person who probably hasn't liked it because it is quite different, and it's also quite different to being. We've been different by being quieter, not louder.
Yeah.
It's not the loudest film that's ever happened. But I think to answer your question on the percussiveness, I think that is part of it. And I think when I started hearing the score coming in, you thought, right. This score absolutely, so it's again interesting. All the instruments are very close mic'd. So actually, when you hear like the violin thing that would sort of pan across you, you could hear the bow against the string. Yeah. So I had the ground, and I think, right, okay, we don't want to have anything in the way of that because that tiny little impact. We don't want to have a load of traffic, a load of street and stuff. And I think, so I've always been a big fan of not having things. We were very lucky in this. Is that Valentino Gianni, who's the production mixer, did it's by far and above the best location sound recording, production sound that I've had to deal with. It was absolutely fantastic. Yeah. So much of it came from that. He was telling me the stories that in Rafe's cassocks, they had 4 places to built in, which had 4 microphones on it. and obviously he had several booms. And but the fact is, with these 4 microphones, we were able to get the sort of the beautiful resonance in almost complete silence without having to use all the denoising tools. And I
Yeah.
think it was a big, big help in that his voice speaking in a room was ambience enough. You know, I mean, to get into plugins, cinematic rooms played quite a big part, and revibe between those two. So they were the essence of the spaces, were people's voices resonating through those plugins into those spaces.
Wow.
And I think I've always been a big fan of. So sometimes been a difficult thing. A director would say, "Can you play us the sounds?" And I say, "I can't really, because the sound of this room is going to be that person speaking in it, and how they resonate." I mean, I was working on The Wonder, and it was quite interesting because there's a lot of scenes in that where it's actually because you have these scenes of people. You know, so there's a committee. It's actually the resonance of their voices are the key sound design element,
Yeah.
and really little else. I'm also a big fan of being very careful with animals. You know, sort of, I don't like the idea that you have these constant, backgrounds of Tweety birds. We do have that in life. It goes into the mundane stuff. But as soon as you don't have them as a general rule, then you can use them for specifics.
Yes.
And I think that, for example, in Conclave, the starlings that appear in the broken window, sort of suddenly, oh yeah, I haven't heard any birds before. They weren't part of the wash or the background or anything. And so they have a sort of, people have interpreted it as a spiritual thing, which is quite right. You know, sort of.
That scene is very powerful. Is there the sound of the sea as well, or like water?
As well as wind, I think, if I remember rightly. What
Wind.
that thing through? Yes, no, it's the wind, but it's sort of like it's coming through bits of broken window.
When there's an explosion,
Yeah.
yeah, obviously there's 2 explosions. There's like kind of one in the background and then one that actually fully happens. So what was the process for doing that? Because obviously that is such a contrast to a lot of the film where it is just voices and sound, and it works because it's so shocking. It feels, but it works in the film. It doesn't feel like outlandish or like it shouldn't be there. It does feel like part of it. And I was wondering how, basically, almost like an alien sound, a sound that really doesn't fit in with the rest of it. How do you make that fit in? And also, what was the process for making that explosion sound? Because, like, I can imagine it was quite a big undertaking.
I mean, it was again. I think the work had been done with the breathing, because he walks up to vote and he looks up and he sees the picture in front, and he holds his breath, and then the thing drops in. So we've dropped everything down to silence. So, I mean, ultimately, I like horror films. So I look for where I can do the shock, the jump moment, and obviously that had been created. The pictures did all of that, and it was about sort of like, I mean, we spent a lot of time with all the detail, and they'd put quite a lot of VFX of things falling down. So that was a developing shot over some weeks as more bits would fall down, and you'd have to have them crashing around the place. But I think it's a simple dynamic of really going from nothing to maximum. Gives it a shock, and I think again. I've always liked films that basically, you go back to Alien and stuff. There's an awful lot of quiet stuff going on, and then the alien leaps out, and it's shocking. And I think sort of there is an element of that. And I remember sort of like when we, again, going back to The Wonder, so Sebastian actually, even though it wasn't a horror film, I kind of shot it with the sort of stylistic eye of a horror film. And so we did the sound with sort of that kind of thing in mind, but there were no horror things in it, apart from actually the story is quite horrific. I remember really quite enjoying that sort of cross genre that when we did Disobedience, that the soundtrack is as much of a science fiction film as you can make it, even though it's about a small group of people in North London. And I quite enjoyed that. So you had kept that in the bottom of your mind. And actually really in the score is the same as if you had, it's like Mothership A docking with Mothership B in this sort of like slow motion Star Trekian thing. But actually it's 2 people finally, sort of having a conversation they should have had years ago.
Yeah.
So I think those sort of things are always fascinating to discuss and to try out. And I think sort of, in Conclave, Edward was very interested to try out lots and lots of things. And I mean, there's lots of things that we tried out and we've not used.
Yeah. Is there any examples of that you can share, like, or ideas that you had that?
Let me try and think. Just try and remember one, because I realised as I was saying that, of course, that it's probably an alarmingly large number of things we tried out actually ended up in the film.
Like what? Like what kind of ideas?
Well, no, because the thing I thought that was not going to work was the sort of the suction of the door, as it's like as the doors close, they sort of go. But actually, he was very keen on that idea that they had this sort of kind of sealing, hermetically sealed element to it. So that actually stayed in. I think so. We had a choir that sang outside. So I think sort of originally at one point before the Starlings appeared, there was a choir that started singing out in St. Peter's Square.
I see.
And so that didn't make it in. But I think the Starlings are much better.
Yes.
So which is quite interesting. Yeah, that's a difficult question to ask, because there's lots of times you sort of sit there. It's like, I think going back to the Wonder, we'd had a different kind of breathing idea that was very internal for Florence Pugh's part, and it didn't really the idea on paper looked like a good idea, but it didn't really work in the same way. So we made it a little not totally internal, and we then used the same technique that we got that for Rafe's. So again, these are things that you build up and you learn as you go on. Yeah.
The other thing I noticed on the subject of doors closing, this is a very specific thought.
Okay.
I noticed there's a scene where they're out talking in a stairwell in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
And it was one of the only times I noticed it. It might have happened before, but it cuts on the sound. Like the sound cuts off. So you hear a door shut and it goes, and it just cuts off before you hear the full amount of the sound.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, like, where that comes from. Is that something that came from you? Is that something that came from, like, one of the editors or a thing? Because, like, it's a very for a film that, like, does feel very hot. There's a lot of, like, when there's like a contrast like that, and it works. It fits in perfectly thematically with the film.
Well, I think Edward was very keen on that. If I remember rightly, in fact, he made the door move so that it was on the cut, so it didn't finish, rather than it was, I think it might have originally been a few frames before, so you had the whole thing and then you cut.
Yeah.
So he's very keen on it. So we did look for places. I mean, every single cut is hard.
Yeah.
And it's just obviously it's usually going from one quiet ambience to another. I think again from the beginning, so like so when you have the Pope's body being taken away, everything is very brutally sharp. So it's really a continuation of that. I think sort of it wasn't specifically highlighting that moment more than the fact that every single cut was a brutal hard cut with no forgiveness. I think it's the energy of the edit, and it's like that's all you're getting. It's kind of, you don't need any more.
You don't need any more.
It happens to be that the door was closing at that point, and that we've cut on to the next bit. So there's little. So I mean, it's part of that. I think the percussive thing that you're talking about.
Yeah.
There are lots of little bits like that. I think sort of there's quite a lot of footsteps that are half cut off and things like that, and all the way through.
It's interesting once again how it creates an intensity from something that is essentially people walking around a room and talking.
I think that's the idea. It is basically stress, and how do you get that stress to the audience?
Yeah.
Again, I think that's the horror thing, isn't it? A little bit that you want in a horror film, you want your audience to feel it, and I think it's just taking. It's not. I'm not saying Conclave's a horror film, but it's to make that physicality.
Yeah, it's taking those conventions and those things that you kind of learn from those as well. I think that can make it. No, and I think that's honestly, it's a triumph. I loved it. I'm so grateful for this interview, but just because of this interview, I found out that John McLean is making a new film.
Oh, right.
I did not know until I saw your button. I was like, what's this? Like, obviously the film's not out yet, so obviously we can't talk much on it, but I was wondering if there is anything you could talk about, like the process of working on John McLean's new film, Tornado.
Yeah, I mean, actually sort of, it was an interesting, we met in a pub to discuss the sound, and so it's one type of film set in a different setting, without going into too much detail, and it's got Tim Roth in it, which I've always thought, that's so cool. I think it was like, I think it was about bringing the one type of film into this other place without spoiling. I think so, because I think it's sort of an integral part of it, and also the fact that there was this performance by Tim Roth that was I thought was really very powerful, but because it was quite a noisy environment, and he'd very much sort of lowered the projections, shall we say, into maximum sort of mumble. I was thinking, right, this is going to be an interesting challenge to bring that out, and how do we do that? And then, of course, it was about how quiet can we make the world until we need it to be noisy. And so there are noisy places, there are fights that go on, but there's this quietness that we get around certain moments, and then suddenly his voice becomes powerful. I mean, it was powerful. It's just you could then hear it as powerful rather than sort of embedded in this wind and stuff. So I think that was probably our biggest challenge in many ways. It's got a little bits of humour in it, and it's also quite dark. Sort of working with, again, a lot on the voices to bring sort of the darkness and the humour together in what they're saying. So we did quite a bit of ADR to sort of connect things.
And how important is that, do you think, to kind of bridge that tone gap between like comedy and like kind of more tragedy?
Well, I think, it's very easy to say this, but when people are speaking, I think it's very important to sort of understand why and what they're saying, and the weight of what someone's saying. I think this is where I sometimes disagree with the sort of more distant recording stuff.
Yeah,
Is that someone speaking quietly 10 feet away in a sort of realistic, they're 10 feet away, is not really, they sound like, well, that's not very, I can't really hear what they're saying. So they're whereas when they're right, their voices are right on top of you, you can feel, in fact, there's a layer, a sub layer of menace that's going on in there. Yeah. I mean, obviously, so I don't want to sit there and have a preference, because it's what the director wants. But in this circumstance, it was really about making his voice have the weight of and the power, even though it was actually this sort of held back. It's a hard word to describe.
Strained.
Well, no, it was. I think once it's out, it's really good. It really works. But on the first hearing, so because it was in amongst a lot of other things, so that's going to be. But you could tell it was good, because you sense that's what you needed to do. So a lot of the work was on that, really. But it was fun. It was also very interesting. John was very much, give it a go. Let's see what you want to do, and then we'll sort of go from there. And so there were lots of things that we'd have discussions about, and there were quite a few discussions between him and the producers. And he says, "Well, no, actually, I didn't think of this, but actually, this is working very nicely." And obviously, again, we would use the balance of noisy and quiet, and there are bits that are very quiet and intimate, so that you would then come down to breathing. And it's not someone breathing the whole way through the film, but you'd still have that sense of they're on their own. And what's scarier than being on your own in silence, and then there's a tiny noise, and you can hear your own heartbeat.
So for Conclave, you had conspiratorial silence, you had stress. Those were like the kind of words. For Tornado, can you say any of the words that kind of inspired you?
Let me think. Well, I don't want to give away. It really was the type of film in its environment was the key words. We kept saying it's it's like
this and this.
It's it's like sort of, because it's not it's like it's a costume drama in a horror film. It's like you got those two conflicting ideas to some degree, and you think, right, don't forget that's what we're doing, so that there would be. There's a sword in it that appears from time to time. And we thought, right, we'll treat this like that film, not the realistic film that it looks like. And so you have this sort of confluence of the styles, which I think makes it very attractive.
Oh, that's I'm very excited. I won't press you more, because I don't want to spoil it for myself.
No, exactly, yeah.
I'm so excited for that film. Because Slow West is genuinely one of my favorite films.
Oh, I'd be lovely to hear what you think about it. It was a great, a lovely experience. We really had great fun doing it.
Okay, so obviously you work on a lot of narrative films, but I've also seen quite a few documentaries.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if your process is different because, as you said, it's about like what the film is about and kind of creating almost that subjective view. While something for a documentary, obviously, one of the kinds of, well, depending on the documentary, its aims is obviously to be a lot more objective. And
Yeah.
is there certain ways or strategies you have to use when working in a documentary versus working in a narrative?
Well, I'd like to say on a broad brushstroke that that no, that the same ultimate goal to get the story across to the audience is the key. And I think, for example, when you, and this is something to, when you work on a documentary, and especially those fly on the wall ones, which have often got shocking bits of recording, what
Yeah.
you do is you do your best to make those recordings work as clearly as possible. You don't sit there and say, I'm going to deliberately make it sound off mic. I want to make it sound as clear as possible so that the audience gets it. So that when you have the situation in a drama, I don't feel necessarily you want to make it, you want to make it as, present as possible. It's the same principle that the words that have been said. So that's my sort of default position to go to. So in the documentary, yeah, you are working on to telling the story. I mean, we did a film on the tsunami, and it is an interesting sort of balance between the truth and making it so that the audience understands it. So all the tsunami footage that was on phones was literally just white noise because it was so, the phones
Yeah.
couldn't handle it. And as we thought, well, we're going to have to rebuild all of that so that you get the sense of the danger, because is actually for an hour and a half is not as dangerous as the sound of a metal girder hitting a car, which is actually what the footage has. So you think, right, I'm going to have to do sort of make that work, but I want to
Is
keep it
there a
within a
balance
context.
you have to do though to make it not as elevated? Like, because I've sometimes found like in documentaries, yes, sometimes the sounds will be like they'll have reverb on or something, and it's like it kind of almost takes away that kind of feeling of like realism
No,
from
it should
the
be perceived as real.
yeah.
I mean, I think the thing
Okay.
about it is, I think what's trying. I mean, even it's like on Conclave, we've tried to pick a point of view of where the microphone and the camera is, and then try to
Yeah.
make it real for that. It just happens to be the microphone is sitting on Ralph Fiennes' shoulders,
Yeah.
and that's how close we are to him, and that's our perspective. So I think that it's with the documentary, you don't want to sit there and feel,
Yeah.
it's like that's Star Wars. But on the other
Yeah.
hand, when a girder comes in and smashes into a car, I think you want to hear the danger of that. So
Yes.
it is a balancing trick, and a lot of these things. I mean, I did quite a few documentaries back, sort of a few years ago. There was one in particular which was very informative on one of the things we do quite a lot, which was on. It was called the 9/11 telephone calls from the towers,
Yeah.
and it's. I mean, I mean, it's really well made documentary, but it's absolutely horrific. And there's a moment where this bloke is in I think the North Tower on the phone to the emergency services, explaining to them that he's probably not going to survive. Could he tell his family that he was all right at the end? And then the tower collapses, and there's a whole discussion about how we're going to do the sound of the tower collapsing.
Yeah.
And we brought forward, he's on the telephone. We're listening down the telephone. There's music going on. And I think when the tower collapses, the line gets cut. And that's everything. That's the music. That's everything. We are disconnected from him.
Yeah.
The film is, and we watched it. It got nominated for a BAFTA, which was great. They played that scene in BAFTA. And I reckon that it ruined the evening for a lot of people.
I can imagine.
And it was something. There's that absolute dead silence. 2001 was doing it. Lots of films have done it, but the absolute dead silence. So when we came to doing the documentary for The Last Breath, which was about 2018, I think it was, there was a bit where the fella's going down. He's a deep sea diver, and his umbilical is connected to a bell that's connected to a ship that's supposed to be able to keep its position in the ocean. That positioning system goes wrong, so the ship drifts away, And he then gets caught in a piece of metal with his umbilical. It's got electricity, it's got heating, it's got oxygen, it's got everything to survive. And he's 150 meters down or something. And, and the tension's building up in the documentary. And then it breaks. And again, we had this whole thing that the score went ballistic at that point. And, so it's all going to be terrible. And we said, well, why don't we try the opposite, which is actually at the moment it breaks, he gets completely cut off. It's a bit fourth wall because it is involving the audience suddenly. They're losing, or it's like the cinema's broken.
Yeah.
So it was interesting, and I was allowed to present that to the director. I mean, the director's a great bloke. He's done a lot of films, and he said you can go away and do that, and we'll have a look at it. And actually, it was extremely shocking. And he sort of bought into it. And then when it came to doing The Last Breath, the drama, which was great to be involved in both the documentary and the drama. And this is why I think, actually, to be fair, I can answer this question about what you're saying because I've done both on the same story. And again, the one thing that all the producers says is that thing you did with the sound, we've got to have that in the film because it's the reason that we're putting the money, it's the reason the whole thing is going, really. It's not. I think I've slightly oversold it now. I mean, it's an interesting story, but it's an important thing. It's an important element of it, and it is the silence there. I was asked about this before, and actually, we'd created a lot of the sounds for the documentary. So the reality that people thought was the reality that we'd created. That we then just brought that into the drama and then embellished it a bit. But actually, we'd already created because he only had. I mean, if you think about it, there aren't crews going down to film what's going on the bottom of the sea. So he only had sort of 30 seconds of actual footage and then interviews. So it was, maybe it's a couple of minutes of footage and interviews. So it was about having to make it feel real. And obviously he hired the boat so that he could get what the real environment was like. But we had to make it feel dramatic and real. So I think, and it was quite interesting. I think I had to talk to Alex before discussing this because it's sort of kind of, hold on a minute, you mean that was all made up? Well, it wasn't. The story's true. But if we put it that it was just a bloke sitting in the room telling you the story, it's not as engaging as showing this is what the boat's like, this is what the bell's like and all the rest of it. So you have to go to that. And I think a lot of the time, and I remember having a discussion with, this is where not one of my highest moments at all, with Walter Murch about a film that he'd done on CERN. And this is a long time ago. And that there was an explosion at CERN. Like one of the power grids blew up. But it's like 2 kilometers down. And there's a shot of the field. And so when the explosion's described, the explosion went off and he put an explosion on. And I remember sort of discussing with after saying, but is that not, you're not telling the truth because you wouldn't hear the explosion from there. And then I realized that the words were coming up my mouth and he was looking at me thinking, yeah, that's you're being an idiot. Of course. That's the thing, because that drama is no less truthful because the shot was a shot of a field over CERN anyway, but actually people get the idea of what was going on. And you didn't need someone in a room to tell you. You could show it. And I think that, again, the human being takes their information in a multimedia fashion. If someone just sits in a room like this and tells you everything, you can't take it all in. You have to show some things as well, and you have to hear some things and smell some things. So I think sort of it is all part of that. So I remember thinking, oh, right, yeah, I wish I could just have thought of that thought 30 seconds before actually opening my mouth. And actually saying something wrong to one of my heroes.
But good for you, though. I think for with the information and the thought that you had in that moment, saying that I think is actually amazing. Because I would I don't think, because like it's interesting because you've actually kind of like unlocked my brain again actually thinking about this, because I always think about the issue, like because obviously film, especially like moving image and that includes sound, it's so easy to manipulate. It's so easy to kind of tell an alternative version to make things more intense. The crowd were violent and then you just add more violent sounds. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And or like you want someone to feel scared when actually it's not something to be scared about. Like, how do you approach that? Because you've kind of like already unlocked it a bit in my head, but like how do you approach that kind of making sure that like you ultimately are telling, do you know what I mean? You're not manipulating an audience, or at least not manipulate, because I suppose you're going to be manipulating the audience anyway. because you're making a video. But like,
Yeah.
is there a kind of way that you, I don't know, kind of solidify it all in your head that like the manipulation is like not wrong, I guess?
Um, yeah, I think it's two things. Firstly, just on the Walter Murch thing. Oh no, my approach to him was, yeah, sorry. Oh God, and then like uttered something about, was it truth? So no, it was probably. Hopefully, he has no memory of it whatsoever, or he has a picture of me with darts in it in his room. But it was a very brief thing. It was the end of the talk, and it was very interesting. And I remember thinking that. So I think that's part of it. Is that he's still telling a truth,
Yeah.
right? It's not that the explosion didn't happen. And it's a way of presenting it in such a fashion that an audience can understand the concept. I mean, the concept of an electrical pylon underground, 2 kilometers down underground, as part of a hadron collider exploding, is a pretty. We have no idea what's it, and it's completely invisible because it happened within a sealed vacuum cylinder and all the rest of it. So, I think it's about having a truth that, and you realise, of course, how the manipulation it is so easy because you just have to slightly realign where your truth is, and then you can say anything you like. And I think that back in the documentary days, I think this is part of one of the reasons that maybe working in features is kind of easy. No, I think there's been interesting things on it, but when you're working for the BBC, you feel that right, we're telling a truth. There have been times now in the later time when you think, oh no, right, this is all it's entertainment. That's the problem, is that where truth, news, and entertainment, where that line is very, very blurred. The 6 o'clock news on the main news is, as far as I can make out, actually entertainment. It's not a in-depth, informed thing. It's something for someone to get a grasp of a little bit of news. I mean, what I do really enjoy about documentaries is it's an opportunity to really get into a subject yourself, and you study lots of things. So with the same fellows did the tsunami, we did a thing on the Berlin Wall, and it's a fascinating journey.
Yeah.
And also a horrific thing on the Beslan #1 school. What was going on behind that atrocity? I mean, it's sort of so in the distant past now, but I remember sort of being fascinated by it. And I did a documentary a couple of years ago on Ronnie O'Sullivan, and again, I got to meet Ronnie O'Sullivan, right? And he's a lovely fella, and it's fascinating the sort of the mental journey that he goes on to be the player that he is. And also, it's very interesting to discover how important sound is. He actually takes the feedback from the sound of the shots, and the feedback from the room is an integral part of that sort of Olympian level play.
Yeah.
You need everything working 100%. But yeah, it is. I mean, the manipulation. I think it's really the responsibility of the viewer to understand that they are being. There's a part of what's going on that is to entertain, not necessarily, but to interest, to fire up something. The reason that you're going to watch it is because of this. And there's very few things that are in there purely to inform, because no one would watch them.
Yeah, I think. Do you know what? I completely agree. That you kind of honestly bridged a gap in my head, because I've had an issue with a lot of documentary series recently and how kind of manipulative they've been. But actually, thinking about it from that perspective, is really interesting. Okay, my final question. This is just my nerdy question now. What kind of sound design ideas or things that you haven't explored yet or wish to explore more of, and what kind of things have been inspiring you recently?
At the root of my interest of film from a child are films like Close Encounters of the Third Kind and, for example, A Few Dollars More, where they have the situation where there's a musical thing that crosses the boundary between the orchestra and the real world, the film world, sorry. Like the little pocket watch in A Few Dollars More. Still, even thinking about it makes the hairs stand up at the back of my neck. And I remember as a kid watching that, because I've got 2 music teachers as parents. Music's been a very, very fundamental part of things. And I think that, in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, when they're on the bit at the end and all the spaceships there and they're doing all the tunes, the actual voice of the spaceships is the orchestra, and you realize, oh my goodness, right? And that is also another moment that's like. And I was 9. I went 14 times in the first month of 9 because for that moment, and still now, and I took my whole family. We booked a row at the BFI when they were showing the sort of the latest cleaned up version, and it was amazing to see my sort of, I think at the time, 15-year-old daughter and her best friend absolutely in awe, and you realize, so it was magical then and it's magical now. I think that was a big influence of, retrospectively, I realized that I like, so music was my thing. So I love, and I think that when we were doing stuff on Disobedience that then went to The Wonder, and there's a conversation between the score and the sound. And actually, interestingly, when on Conclave, I think I've had a few interesting conversations with Volker Bertelmann, and he's quite interested in the idea of maybe a little bit of interchange, just to see whether we can get a little bit of that connection between the music and the sound. So I think exploring that further, I think this sort of is something that I'd like to do. And actually, when we did Starvaker, and again that was Matthew Herbert, we were able to we created winds using. I have a 416 microphone and my daughter's flute, an exact fit. So I had all these sort of turbulent winds blowed in, but creating notes using the flute that would then meet the score. So that the ball boundaries of where the score started and ended and went into wind was completely blurred. So I'd like to explore that sort of thing further. I also like the idea of one day doing a film that is only breathing. And there's someone who can only hear breathing. So you have people's mouths moving, but you can only hear the breathing. That could be quite, but I think it'd probably have to be a 5-minute short. All right.
Okay. So thank you so much for coming on, Ben.
Yeah, very welcome. Nice to meet you.
And that was my chat with Ben Baird. I didn't want to say it at the start in case it influenced your ears, but Ben, being the sound hound that he is, sent me over his lusciously recorded audio WAV files, and it made my home mic setup feel so inadequate by comparison. I hope you didn't notice it during the show before I said anything anyway. Although I guess if you did notice, then that's because you're a fellow sound nerd and hopefully got a lot more from this podcast, and I hope my mic quality wasn't too distracting. I got so much from my chat with Ben. He really affirmed how the joy of telling a good story, whether through video, image or sound or some kind of magical combination of it all, it really just shows that when you have people who really care and it all lines up just right, it can make something greater than the sum of its parts. In short, I really liked Conclave. It could have been so boring, it could have been a very different film, and yet it wasn't. I just loved it. Sorry if you haven't seen it, although I do still recommend it. We didn't spoil the whole film, and to be honest, it doesn't matter. It's so good watching a thriller without any car chases or gun battles. It's just people talking, and the sound is part of this element of just real suspense that I can't get over. It's so good. I'm going to stop talking now about that, I promise. We didn't cover it while recording, but as me and Ben were saying goodbye, we did end up having a quick discussion about the rise of the AI stuff we all keep hearing about. And much like Stephen Yee from the last episode, it fell back to this human element, that joy of creation and of hunting and of finding what makes a good story come out right. And how that's something I really don't think AI could ever replace. Make it faster in some cases, yeah, probably, but not truly craft something that you can connect to in the same way. That's what I think anyway, and I just want to say one last thank you to you for listening to this podcast, and through that, helping me have an opportunity to meet all these amazing people who do awesome things. We've got some awesome episodes coming up as well, so do subscribe and comment and share this podcast to anyone you think you might like it, and also rate it on the podcast store of choice. It all really does help keep this going. Check out RedShark News for all of your video world news. We've got some good articles up there coming up this week, and we'll be back in 2 weeks. And in the meantime, look after yourselves.